So thank you so much for coming here today, online and in person. Today we have the pleasure to have Professor Werner Scholtz. Professor Werner Scholtz obtained his doctorate in law from Leiden University, and currently he is professor at the Law School of University of Southampton in the UK. He is the head of the school and professor of global environmental law. Professor Werner Scholtz is also extraordinary professor of the Global Environmental Law Center at the University of Western Cape in Cape Town, South Africa. Among others, Professor Scholtz is an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow, and he has served on several international law association committees and has held several honorary positions at higher education institutes in South Africa and United Kingdom, and also in Germany. Professor Scholtz specializes in international environmental law, and his current research focuses on the consequences of increasing the importance of animal welfare in international wildlife law. Today's presentation is entitled Cultural Clashes, Aboriginal Subsistence Whaling and Whaling Welfare. Professor Scholtz, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for that kind introduction, colleagues. If you don't mind, I'm going to stand up. I'm not very fond of sitting. So thank you for inviting me to present some of the research that I've done. This is based on a publication submitted recently to a journal. And so any comments would be really welcome, and discussions and so forth concerning the complexity of the issue. Let me first start with a reference to quotes. And I think those two quotes actually summarize the crux of the matter. So you have Dr. Harry Lill, who was a ship's physician in the 18th century during the whaling industry. And one of the things that he mentioned was that whales scream during, I see there it is, whales scream during a whale hunt. So it's about the really cruel nature of whaling in terms of using the harpoon, ship, small target, all those issues, and then the time to death, the TTD, being quite long. So he has made various of these remarks. He also referred to the fact that whale hunting, observing whale hunting, is like watching sort of horses running with metal hooks through the streets in a very bloody fashion. So it's a very sort of if you read it, it's quite very explicit. And then on the other hand, there's another interesting quote. I'm not going to go into, you can read it. It's about the relationship between indigenous peoples and whales, the historic relationship, and it refers to heritage and values, culture, rituals, ceremonies. Just do some really interesting opposing views in these two different quotes. One being quite explicit, the screaming of whales being hunted, and the other one, the importance, the value, and the significance of whaling for indigenous people. And just to mention, Dr. Harry Lill obviously was a ship's physician on a whaling ship, so it was an industrial enterprise. But obviously, the cruelty pertains to both of these issues, which I'll explain shortly. I think my remote control's not working. So I've just given you those two contradictions in terms of the quotes. In terms of setting the stage, what I want to talk about, this is actually based on a publication, it's quite interesting, that I've written in 2017. And in that 2017 publication, which is quite a number of years ago, I argued for the fact that humane killing in terms of the IWC, the International Whaling Convention, is a manifestation of a general principle or a convergence on a general principle of international law. And I've explained that in terms of the evolution interpretation of the preambular objectives in the Whaling Convention. That was 8 years ago. I don't want to reflect on that. So what I'll tell you is just take my word for it. The question that I raised, and I remember in that introduction was, or in the conclusion, I then indicated on the basis of that general principle of international law of humane killing, it was not possible to continue with any form or with commercial whaling. The reason being that it's not possible to conduct humane killing of whaling. It's impossible. The IWC or the whaling committee also indicated that in a few resolutions. So I made it clear, commercial whaling in terms of the recognition of that principle, the convergence upward principle, is impossible. And that was sort of an avenue that I used in order to counter the arguments for whaling in a very sort of legalistic manner. The question that I then raised was, but what about Aboriginal subsistence whaling? And then I didn't answer it because in the footnote I said, I'm not going to reflect on this. So now 8 years later, I decided to do it. That is the exact question. If we accept the fact that humane killing as a manifestation of the general principle of international law actually prohibits commercial killing, what about the issue of Aboriginal subsistence whaling? Now, ASW is in paragraph 13 of the schedule, which is an integral part of the convention, the International Whaling Convention. And essentially it provides for whaling for certain Aboriginal groups. And I've mentioned the relevant countries and the groups. The Maka tribe is not absolutely clear because at one stage they were allowed to conduct whaling because this is a decision that needs to be made by a scientific committee, and they've resumed whaling again at a later stage. But those are the countries of relevance. It's also interesting, so these are the indigenous or Aboriginal people. So the word Aboriginal is not defined, but clearly in terms of practice and precedent, it refers to indigenous peoples. This is a controversial, the St. Vincent and Grenadines example is quite controversial because those people are not indigenous whalers at all. And I'll explain that later as well. And if we read paragraph 13, you'll see that it refers to the hunted whale populations are maintained at healthy levels to enable native people to hunt whales at levels that are appropriate to cultural and nutritional requirements in the long term. And therefore, you also have those submissions in terms of nutritional submissions to the scientific committee who makes these decisions concerning whaling quotas for those groups. So the crux of the matter is it's not for commercial purpose. Once again, there is a bit of complexity there because what we see in terms of Greenland is frequently you find whale meat in supermarkets hunted in terms of ASW. So that is also, you can see there are quite a number of complex issues surrounding this. But essentially what we see is it's an exemption, paragraph 13, to the moratorium on commercial whaling, because we don't have commercial whaling anymore because of the 1982 moratorium. So we have scientific whaling, commercial whaling is a prohibition in terms of the moratorium, and then we have ASW. And ASW is an exemption to commercial whaling because it's not intended for commercial purposes, but it refers to cultural and nutritional requirements of those specific groups. Next slide, please. And then the question is, if we make that argument, which I've just made, how does it apply to ASW? And that is the difficulty here. Now, just to refer to a few interesting aspects, when we talk about indigenous peoples, obviously we know that they've been subjugated to colonial settlement. They have that continuity with pre-colonial societies. They have a very distinct identity. And there's also a very strong focus on the preservation of the nature of their cultures. So that cultural component is quite relevant here. In addition to that, a very strong collective spiritual relationship to the land. And that land includes natural resources, animals such as whales and so forth. But there's also a dependence on those natural resources, a link to those so-called nutritional requirements. And then, just to give you one example, when we talk about collective, cultural practices and nutrition, we think about issues such as hunting, for instance, in accordance with their cultural practices. And there's a comprehensive international normative framework dealing with these aspects, which I'm not going to refer to. both with the very strong collective spiritual relationship to land and natural resources, but also those cultural practices recognized as Aboriginal practices in terms of the lethal exploitation of, for instance, wild animals. General comment number 23, for instance, refers to, fishing and hunting and so forth. So there are various examples of this. Although this ASW, and it obviously stems from an instrument of 1948, although it refers to subsistence, that nutritional requirement of substance, it is more based on cultural diversity. So it has sort of progressively grown with a stronger focus on the issue of culture and the cultural identity of those Aborigines. So that we can actually talk, next slide, please. So that we can actually talk about a cultural right to whaling in terms of the ASW. It's quite interesting that the IWC predates for instance, all these instruments, UNDRIP concerning Indigenous peoples. That was one of the first sort of inclusions of a cultural right of Aboriginal people, of Aborigines in relation to natural resources and land and so forth. The issue in terms, so what I've just sketched is, we have that moratorium, that prohibition on commercial whaling, but then we have the exemption, and does it make sense? An exemption is based, currently, there's a strong focus on cultural identity, recognized in international law as well. It's not only the IWC. But the problem is, if we just go back to what I've said, take the slides back, thank you. Hopefully you can all remember the first slide. If we go back to that first slide, I told you that my argument was based on the cruelty of whaling. And that cruelty is that quote of the ship's physician relates to industrial practices. And in terms of the work being done by the committee, whaling committee, they've deliberated on humane killing, made suggestions concerning more humane practices, utilization of modern technology, secondary killing methods with rifles, and so forth. But the indigenous nature of whaling is frequently more cruel because it does not make provision for the utilization always of, the more technological methods. So, and it's not in all cases. There was a move, obviously, towards the incorporation of secondary kill methods such as rifles and so forth. I'm not stating that all indigenous peoples use the exact same methods, but in general, the traditional methods have been more cruel than the commercial methods. And one is the harpoon line flow technique. So the TTD, the time to death of whales exposed to AWS, is significantly more. So there's a longer period of suffering of the prey in this instance. And so if we consider that, the logical extension of my argument concerning humane killing means that obviously you can't continue with Aboriginal subsistence whaling because of the aspect of humane killing as a general principle of international law. That's quite clear. That's the logical extension. But, and here's the but, the problematic component where it becomes difficult. What we can establish is a matrix of complexity in terms of divergent interests underlying this problem. What we see is essentially, and that goes back to the first slide, we have the cultural rights of Indigenous peoples recognized in terms of international law, both in IWC, but also affirmed and supported by other instruments. And that was in the, there was a few years ago before the issue of wild animal welfare became more prominent. But with this sort of the progressive recognition of this general principle of international law, whale welfare, we can now see that there's a dimension of the welfare interests of whales. And the question is, how do we assess, appraise, and understand this matter? And the question then is, made a cultural right to whaling essentially exempt Indigenous peoples from adhering to the general principle of animal welfare. And that is the question. Now that I've talked for 30 minutes about the background, we can actually address the question. And so essentially what we're talking here about is the issue of cultural relativism. But it differs from the typical debate in human rights. Because usually in human rights, you have cultural relativism as an exemption from human rights. But in this instance, we're talking essentially about the right to culture, which constitutes an exemption to the general principle of international law of humane killing. And that is the complexity here. So that, yes, there is moral relativism, but it's it differs from the typical human rights debate, and it's quite complex. And next slide, please. So if we consider these issues in the context of moral relativism, there is an interesting publication of 2011 by Werner, so he did not deal with Aboriginal subsistence whaling per se, but he dealt with the issue of animal welfare and ethics of the International Whaling Commission. So he challenges that relativism that underlies this issue between, on the one hand, hunting and diversity, because Aboriginal subsistence whaling is just part of the debate. There's also the debate from the Japanese and Norwegian sides, whereby they indicate that they also have a right based on culture to whaling. I'm not dealing with that. We can transpose some of these findings to those debates. I want to focus on Indigenous peoples. So it's within that context that he challenged moral relativism. Essentially, that form of relativism indicates that, the humane, universality, so in this instance, humane killing is not absolute, but it's culture specific. So that's one thing. And so the problem with this view is the fact that one group or one culture or a tribe has a view on whaling as something that is acceptable does not make it so. And that is, I think, also quite logical. And the problem in this instance with this position, this relativist position, is the fact that it undermines the degree of progressive consensus. And I can link this to the general principle of international law on the moral status of animals. So it sort of ignores the fact that there's a growing consensus regarding this matter. Next slide, please. So it ignores, it fails to take recognition of the universality or the growing universality of these views. We can see, for instance, not all cultures treat animals in the exact same manner, but what we do note is a plethora of normative rules and regulations in the majority of domestic jurisdictions dealing with anti-cruelty, similar to the discussion here. That's the one thing. So it's that failing to take cognizance of that consensus building in terms of the relativist position. There's also a second problem with this, which, like, stepping away from Garner's idea of moral relativism, and that's if you talk about moral relativism or cultural-specific relativism in terms of Indigenous peoples, you sort of create the idea that all Indigenous peoples are the same, they have the same views and beliefs, especially concerning whaling. And that's not true. The Maori people is the best example here. So, for instance, where you have certain cultures, the Maka tribe, who they rely on the lethal exploitation of whales as a marker of cultural distinction. We have the Maori tribes. They have a different view concerning whales. They rely on a spiritual connection, and they averse to the hunting of whales. So for them, the hunting of whales is a problematic aspect. To take it further, if you consider the fact that one group now will continue with whale hunting in terms of ASW, that will have a detrimental impact on the cultural practice of non-lethal whaling of Maoris. So it's not whaling in the sense of hunting whales, of having that reverence, cultural reverence for the worth of whales, because that is not something that is linked to a specific territory, or it's not the fact that a Maka tribe or another tribe actually kills whales will have an impact on the sentiments of the Maori, wherever they are. There's also another aspect to this, and it links to another issue, and that is an issue which I've referred to as global welfare implications based on common concern of humankind, which I can't go into too much detail. I've written something on it. I think I've forgotten about it as well. But I've indicated in a publication of the Oxford Handbook on Animal. I think you've also contributed to it.
Which one?
The Oxford Handbook on global animal law. That's it. And there I've indicated that there are certain global welfare implications in terms of the common interest of humankind. I think it will be released at some stage. Yes. So there's also what I'm trying to indicate is that there are global implications of whale hunting for the cultural practices of other people, not only people, but indigenous peoples. And that is also problematic. So there's not an homogeneous approach to this issue. Next slide. That's the second thing. There's a third aspect to drill down further into the detail. When we talk about Aborigines, once again, we also think that within the tribes, we have homogeneous views, but that is also not true. The resumption of whaling by the Maka was a very interesting example of inter-tribe descent. For instance, you had elders who didn't want to resume whaling again after, I think it was 30 years. It was going to be extremely expensive, and whale watching was a more profitable industry. They didn't want to do it. So what happened to them is they were all ostracized, literally ostracized from the tribe. And so, it's so in addition to the failure of the relativist position in terms of universal consensus, you can also see within the tribe or between indigenous peoples, those sort of, I would say, cracks in terms of the arguments. But there's another fourth aspect, which I'd like to highlight. And this is on the basis of the fact that what we see essentially, if we analyze this argument of whale hunting, frequently, for instance, the Maka tribe or other Aborigines as well, they refer to the fact that the whales willingly give themselves. So they're not really hunting the whales. So part of the cultural practice is they have a number of cleansing ceremonies. They have very specific rituals and rites of passage in terms of the captain of the boat, the monsters. So it's very, very tightly controlled in terms of customary practice. And that all forms part of the ideal that they have of the ideal life for the tribe. So it's that ideal life. We have customary practices and certain rules and regulations dealing with the sort of preparations prior to the hunt, period during the hunt, but then also the distribution of the profit afterwards. So it's all well regulated. That's the ideal way of life and hunting. And that's in terms of the fear of the good. The good is being, as a Maka tribe, we conduct whale hunting, and we do it in this and that manner. But that fear of the good actually conflates, or that position that relativists hold, actually they conflate the theory of the good, the ideal way of life, with the fear of the right. And the question is whether it's right to conduct whaling. And in terms of that, the right should actually take precedence. So that concept of stating the whale does not suffer because there's a sort of consensus to be killed it's a fiction to a great extent. That's obviously a normative narrative created by, in terms of the societal expressions of a certain tribe concerning the hunt. That's the ideal. But the question is it right? And then we can go back again to that, to what I've mentioned about universal consensus about suffering, because sufficient empirical evidence actually provides us with a clear picture of the suffering of whales in terms of not only commercial whaling, but also indigenous practices in terms of TTD that I've mentioned. Essentially, whales do have I prefer to write not in a legal sense there, but an entitlement maybe to be free from harm. And that is the right. And that right should actually take precedence over the fear of the good. There's a fifth argument. And this is based on a publication of 1984, which is extremely old. Yes. And the question is, why did I include it? It's because this is sort of the locus classicus of relativism, cultural relativisms, and that's why I've used it. When we read Jack Donnelly's, so it has nothing to do with whaling, it never refers to whaling, but we can actually utilize the arguments. So he refers to unrestricted relativism and unrestricted universalism. On the spectrum, those are the opposing sort of views on the spectrum. And he considers them both to be inappropriate. So there needs to be something in between to reconcile relativism with universalism. And if we apply that sort of notion, what we see in terms of AWS, it relies very strongly on, it has a very strong focus on strong relativism. What is strong relativism? In terms of what Donnelly described is the internal evaluations of the practice. So in this instance, the views of the tribe, the consensus of the tribe. That's internally, that's a strong relativism. This is the fear of good. We enjoy hunting whales, we're going to hunt whales. And therefore, we don't have to abide by the exemption as well as the issue of universalism. But this form of strong relativism also needs to stand up to external scrutiny, because otherwise you're going to land up in this form of relativism, which is unrestricted, which is absolute. And so that form of external scrutiny is to whether the practice presents a plausible and coherent defense concerning universalistic criticism. So can we take that strong relativism and just use it, or should we also consider the positions of the universalists? Next slide, please. And what he states is, as a general rule, the more important the practice, the greater the force of internal standards, which can be overridden only by particularly strong external judgments. So in this instance, ASW is an expression in general. We've also noticed the divergent views and the fact that it's more complex of that manifestation of cultural diversity in the right to whaling. So it's it has a strong form of relativism in terms of the internal evaluations. And it can only be overridden by strong external judgments. Now, this is what I refer to as a crude rule. It's not very helpful in this instance. And so Donnelly proposes a distinction between variations in substance, interpretation, and form in terms of this. And what we see is the qualitative measure of interpretation, which it proposes, can actually be used in this instance. Because what we can do in terms of the strong external judgments of universalism, that consensus regarding the morality and status of whales could actually be used in order to, or for a measure of interpretation of whaling, to offer a reconciliation between the two absolutes and to meet in a certain point. So there's a potential for reconciliation for interpretation. And so what I've done is I've interpreted the right to, so the cultural right to whaling in terms of ASW to allow for whaling, but the non-lethal utilization of whales, which means whale watching operations led by Aborigines. So in terms of the debate of utilizing moral relativism, we can quite clearly see that there are various problems with this proposal in terms of moral relativism, but there's a possibility of reconciliation as proposed by Donnelly through a qualitative interpretative measure, and that could lead to whale watching. That's not the end of it, though. Next slide, please. How am I doing in terms of what time? I'm still
Perfect.
I'm still fine. Just let me know if I exceed any implicit rule of some sorts. So where are we now? I'll just take you back. I've indicated that ASW is problematic due to the fact that it's crueler than usually crueler than commercial whaling. That's the first thing. The general principle, or the convergence of the general principle of humane killing, means that the logical expansion of that argument means we can't continue with it. But the problem is it's a cultural right. And therefore, in terms of the opposing sort of the strong or unrestricted forms of relativism, it poses a problem. But we can reconcile it through a qualitative interpretation of the measure, as proposed by Donnelly, to lead to whale watching. And for me, that proposal is something which I think adheres to three principles proposed by Decker in an interesting publication in 2007. She refers to the three principles as to ensure that culture is not removed from the ethical domain. So you can't view culture in that unrestricted sort of form as something that is just, you remove ethics, you remove the suffering of whales because there's culture. That's the first thing. That's what we've done with the reinterpretation of, the qualitative interpretation of whaling. The second principle is a caring approach to animals. So following that more caring approach. And the third thing is, or the third aspect is new non-lethal cultural practices which do not rely on lethal killing as a marker of cultural distinction. That's whale watching. So it can be a cultural practice, but it does not rely on killing in order to provide for that marker. So that is what Decker refers to as a post-colonial, post-humanist ethical discourse, which includes no immunity for culture, giving up the human center, and contextualizing cultural contexts. And I think that interpretation of whaling towards whale watching is something that actually could result in the principles proposed by Decker. Next slide, please. So that's the positive thing, I think. Now, the practical issues, that all sounds quite interesting. Moving towards this non-lethal cultural whaling and reconciling universalism and relativism. But how should it be done? And I think we can already, what I always find important is when we have arguments concerning the lega ferenda, the lega ferenda proposals. Because if you ask me, what do I want? I would say world peace. Well, there's no current basis anywhere which will provide me with that. So I think it's really important to find the hooks in law when we make these de lege ferenda proposals, that we are able to transform them in some normative frameworks. My arguments are theoretical de lege ferenda proposals, but based on what I refer to those hooks, those glimmers of hope in law. How can we do this? How can we actually ensure that there's this paradigm shift? First of all, through repurposing the voluntary fund for Aboriginal subsistence whaling. So there's a fund, contributions are being made by the members of the IWC to assist communities to transform to different practice. Let me just go back a bit. The current fund actually provides for funding for Aboriginal communities hunting whales in relation to utilization of more humane killing techniques. So you can actually change that to a fund which provides them with funding for this transformation to non-lethal practices. So that is the first possibility. It's not in contravention of the nature and objectives of the fund. It already exists. The hunters could also be compensated for their knowledge about whales. So what we see in terms of the normative framework that I've just briefly referred to, and other provisions in the UNDRIP and various other instruments, we actually frequently, what you find is this affirmation of indigenous peoples as conservation stewards because of the specialized knowledge that they have. So this could be also very much in line with that notion of being conservation stewards. But there could be a financial compensation as well when they act in this manner. So that is really important to ensure that. And I'll explain why. Next slide, please. So I've now proposed for non-lethal whaling as a form of reconciliation between the two extremes, which adheres to the logical extension of my argument concerning the general principle of international law of humane killing. I think it makes sense. Maybe you don't, but we'll talk about it later. I think there are hooks in the current, not only law, but also the current system. We could actually facilitate it. But there's a problem with this argument, which I'm very aware of, and something that I think we can discuss further. And I would like to actually challenge my own proposal now. Maybe destroy it even, which is, I don't think, a good thing. But anyway, this proposal that I've just made is, so I think it can be criticized heavily, and I'll just tell you why. So I'd like to step outside my own, because sometimes you write something you think it's just really wonderful, and then you realize that maybe it's not. And this is where I'm now going to step outside and criticize what I've just told you. For instance, Nancy C. Doubleday refers to the fact that if you end Aboriginal subsistence whaling, you will destroy, that's the word that she uses, their cultural way of life, because of the way in which whaling is an intrinsic part of the culture of those Aborigines. So it's not merely about going out on boats and killing whales. It's about the way in which society is structured. It's based on whaling. So the death of a culture, that's a possibility. Now, I say this with I'll make a few statements about this matter, but I also say it with a certain fear and trepidation, and I'll also explain to you why. So the first thing is, I think it change cultural practice. This cultural practice is non-lethal whaling in terms of whale watching. Because essentially what you'll do is you have a new cultural practice, which is not something that is totally divergent in terms of what existed previously. It's a new format, essentially. And culture is not static. In terms of General Comment 21 of ECOSOC, the reference was made to culture as a living process. Culture is not something that should be, static, stuck we'll have the same culture for the next 600 years. It's dynamic. There's another aspect that I gave some thought about. If we talk about cultural identity as a form of cultural diversity, if some of these elements, so the element lost here is whale killing, whale hunting, it does not mean that prohibition will mean that the whole culture is lost in terms of cultural diversity. It's an element of culture because you'll still have non-lethal whaling. Next slide, please. That's the first problem, I think, with this argument. And I'm sort of providing a brief overview of the matter, but I think it's something we need to discuss further because I have further thoughts about this. It's a problematic aspect. The second thing is, I think this is also problematic in terms of my proposal, is that it could be seen as racist, ethnocentric, or sort of an imperial imposition, because I'm not indigenous, and I don't really have the knowledge about these cultures. So I'm from the outside, I'm imposing something from my own perspectives. That is, I think, something that is also problematic. It could create the idea of, the dichotomy between the backward barbaric culture of people killing whales, indigenous peoples, versus the Western civilization, the humane culture of Western civilization. I've never hunted whales, but also I've never been exposed to it. It's never been part of my culture. I don't understand it. And so that is also a very problematic thing. It's easier for me to make these proposals, obviously. And I'll get back to this as well with reference to the exposure that I've had in terms of culture. So that is something that I'm very aware of when I raise these issues. I need to mention that. The problem with that is, to an extent, this, especially in terms of imperialism. If we go back to St. Grenadines, the argument that or the reference that I've made there, as one of the countries who actually conduct Aboriginal whaling subsistence. The major argument for them, in terms of, because they don't have that culture, we're not talking about indigenous peoples, we're talking about people who were slaves who were subjugated to oppression. And so in that instance, they've learned to conduct whaling. And it is sort of the form of ASW in terms of those groups in the country is actually a form of compensation for the injustices that occurred because of oppression. But that is a very problematic argument, invoking that argument of cultural imperialism as a ground for the sort of perpetuation of cruelty and suffering of whales. So they have to pay for colonial oppression and enslavement. Why should they pay for our sins as humans? They're whales. So quite problematic. Why should we continue with this? I think it could be a very difficult debate, and it is. But I think those would be my arguments in relation to the possibility of those sort of attacks. I think what is needed is an inclusive process of dialogue and cross-cultural learning. So this needs to happen on that basis. And that transition to non-lethal Aboriginal whaling, it requires a process of participation of Indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. And it's a very difficult process. It's a very complex and controversial process because you have all these divergent interests existing and issues of injustice also in this regard. And the difficulty of, on the one hand, not perpetuating injustice against whales, but also not perpetuation of injustice against Indigenous peoples. So it's really difficult. Essentially, and that's why I've said we need a position whereby we navigate these interests. On the one hand, anti-whaling advocates should acknowledge the historical context of suppression and subjugation of Indigenous peoples, respect the cultural traditions and cultural diversity. And Indigenous peoples should not reduce all arguments to colonialism, and remember that whales should not necessarily pay for colonialism. And I think that this treaty is a good example of such an approach, so that there is a concrete example available that could be followed. A very important thing would be to utilize the participatory rights. And there I refer to the FPIC, in International Law, Principle of Free, Prior and Informed Consent for Indigenous Peoples, and in Article 27 of the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we see that it's also included in there. So this process should be based on FPIC. Next slide, please. So where does it leave us at this stage? And yes, in terms of free, prior, and informed consent, I think it's also something that we can discuss. What about, I should not say this because I'm now going to counter my own arguments, but what about the instance where people, Aboriginal people or Indigenous peoples, do not want to move towards non-lethal whaling in terms of using FPIC? We can talk about that as well. So what have I done? I've indicated that the logical expansion of my argument concerning humane killing results in the same sort of prohibition in terms of ASW. So ASW is an exemption. It just cannot hold water. But I've indicated that the issue is really complex in terms of the legal recognition of the rights, cultural rights of Indigenous peoples, and the issue of moral relativism. I've made use of the qualitative interpretation of the measure to move towards non-lethal whaling. But even that is problematic, as I've indicated. And it requires careful consideration, the balancing of different interests in order to make sure that it's not a Western imperialist sort of project of sort of ethnocentrism, an agenda of ethnocentrism. So the last question, and then I'm going to conclude, is what now in terms of the convention? Because these issues that I've raised are also the lega ferenda, my views and proposals. What we see is that the IWC is obviously an international agreement in terms of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. So Article 31(3)(c) is applicable in terms of the interpretation of the Vienna Convention, which means that the killing methods are not you must deal with the killing methods in terms of welfare issues. And that is if we accept the recognition of the general principle of international law of humane killing. So it has an effect on the interpretation of the instrument. So that killing methods, because that's in the shadow of the convention, should be read in terms of the welfare of whales. But what we need is an amendment. If you want to stop ASW, because it exists in terms of Schedule 13, it means you need an amendment, because that's not sufficient. So essentially what is needed is an amendment in terms of the Article 5 of the Convention. That is the possibility in order to remove that to make provision for non-lethal whaling. But then the question is, can you actually amend the provision in the Whaling Convention, which deals with the whaling, it deals with the killing of whales. That is essentially what it relates to. And the industry of whaling, it was in response to the whaling wars that occurred and the depletion of whaling stock. And then the question is, can you do that? And I've argued for an evolutionary interpretation of the IWC. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what we can see is in terms of that is if you read the objectives in the preamble in terms of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, it does not exclude a possibility to allow for an amendment which provides for non-lethal whale watching. So it is possible to do that if it's in line with those requirements in Article 5 too. Will this happen? No, I've just talked 40 minutes nearly, and now I'm really going to sink the ship. I think the chances are very, very, very slim for an amendment. Let's be quite honest, especially in terms of the current dynamics of the Whaling Convention. So what are the prospects currently? So I've kept you busy now 40 minutes and wasted your time. Is that the conclusion that we have to make? I don't think so. I think this is part of a certain momentum moving towards the recognition of the moral status of whales, as they've been referred to as peoples of the sea. And I think there is a certain momentum. I don't know if you've ever read the publication, the American Journal of International Law of D'Amato and Chopra, the entitlement of the right to life of whales. It's been years back. But you can see there's a certain progressive momentum there. And I think this should be part of that momentum to move towards a different position, to move towards a paradigm shift. We have certain glimmers of hope currently in international law, rights of nature and so. We have in domestic jurisdictions various interesting judgments concerning the rights of animals, wild animals and so. And this is part of that momentum towards recognizing the right to life of whales. And I see it as what I've referred to as another brick in the wall, building towards that process. Currently, the only possibility would then be the recommendations in terms of Article 4 of the IWC to make recommendations in terms of whale welfare. But it's until that, this is the current provision that we have. This does not take away, distract from the legal arguments that I've made to its moving to this position on to its non-lethal whaling. I think it will be a difficult process. I don't think it's an impossible process. Next slide, please. I've concluded with a quote, my own quote. Isn't that wonderful? So, I couldn't remember this, so I just included it. So essentially is this, my advocacy, my legal advocacy for non-lethal utilization of whales does not need to amount to a form of imperialism or colonialism. It can be synonymous with a general counter-hegemonic ethic aimed at non-violence against and compassion and justice for humans, indigenous peoples, as well as animals, the whales. And so it's an opportunity to move from suspicions of imperialism towards an ethical and ecological relationship between humans and animals, where anthropocentrism does not fully dominate the discourse. That sounds good. I like it. Okay. So thank you very much for your time and your attention. You can maybe move on to the next slide, and I'm open for any questions that you have. Thank you for your time.